The Age of Jackson, The Rise of Democracy in America, written by Harry Montgomery, narrated by Cedar Reyes. Chapter 1: The Making of a Leader. Andrew Jackson's rise to prominence began in the backwoods of the Carolinas, where he was born in 1767 to Irish immigrant parents. Orphaned at a young age and shaped by the violence of the Revolutionary War, Jackson's early years were filled with hardship and struggle. These formative experiences instilled in him a fierce independence and an unwavering sense of personal honor, traits that would define his character for the rest of his life. Largely self-taught and known for his fiery temper, Jackson developed a reputation for toughness, earning the nickname Old Hickory from soldiers who served under him. Despite limited formal education, he pursued a career in law and eventually moved westward to Tennessee, where he would find opportunity and recognition. Jackson's military career was the first major platform that launched him into the national spotlight. During the War of 1812, he was appointed a general in the U.S. Army and quickly demonstrated his capabilities as a leader. His most celebrated moment came at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. Although the battle technically took place after the war had officially ended, with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, news had not yet reached American forces. Jackson's troops, composed of militia, freedmen, Native Americans, and even pirates, faced a professional British army. Against the odds, they achieved a decisive victory, inflicting heavy casualties while suffering minimal losses. This triumph turned Jackson into a national hero and a symbol of American resilience and patriotism. The victory solidified his image as a man of action who could defend the country against foreign threats. Following his military success, Jackson transitioned into politics with a growing base of support. He served briefly in the Senate and later as the governor of the Florida Territory, but it was his growing popularity with ordinary Americans that set him apart. In a time when political power was still dominated by elite families and educated aristocrats, Jackson's background made him an appealing figure to the common man. His supporters saw in him someone who understood their struggles and would fight against corruption and privilege. This growing public admiration set the stage for his presidential campaigns and the political movement that would become known as Jacksonian democracy. Jackson's initial attempt to win the presidency in 1824 ended controversially when he lost despite winning the popular vote. The House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams in what Jackson's followers called a corrupt bargain. This perceived injustice only strengthened Jackson's resolve and his appeal to voters who felt excluded from the political process. By the time the 1828 election arrived, Jackson was poised to challenge the status quo with a powerful coalition of supporters drawn from rural communities, frontier settlers, and working-class citizens. The making of Andrew Jackson as a leader was not the result of privilege or institutional favor, but rather the product of resilience, reputation, and the changing tides of American democracy. His journey from orphan to general to national figure laid the groundwork for one of the most transformative political eras in United States history. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in which power would begin to shift from elite hands into those of a broader public, with Jackson as the figurehead of that change. Jackson's early life and military fame. Andrew Jackson's early life was marked by loss, hardship, and a relentless will to survive. Born in 1767 in the Waxhaws region along the border of North and South Carolina, Jackson entered the world only weeks after his father died. His mother, left to raise 3 sons alone, struggled to provide stability. During the Revolutionary War, the young Jackson faced extreme adversity. At just 13, he served as a courier for the local militia and was captured by the British. While imprisoned, He was struck in the face with a saber after refusing to clean a British officer's boots, a scar he bore for the rest of his life. The war also took the lives of his two brothers and eventually his mother, who died of cholera while nursing American prisoners. By the age of 15, Jackson was an orphan, hardened by conflict and driven by a personal code shaped through trauma and defiance. With little formal education, Jackson nonetheless studied law and was admitted to the bar in North Carolina in his early 20s. He moved to the Tennessee frontier, where opportunity awaited those bold enough to seize it. Jackson thrived in this rough environment, practicing law, acquiring land, and becoming a planter and slave owner. His bold personality and reputation for fearlessness brought him into Tennessee's political scene, where he served as a delegate to the state's constitutional convention and was elected its first congressman. Still, it was his military leadership during the early 1800s that catapulted him into national fame and made him a household name across the country. Jackson's military fame began to rise during conflicts with Native American tribes in the South, particularly in the Creek War. In 1814, he led American forces to a decisive victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where hundreds of Creek warriors were killed. This victory opened millions of acres of native land to white settlers and earned Jackson a promotion to Major General in the U.S. Army. But it was his leadership during the War of 1812, and especially the Battle of New Orleans, that cemented his reputation. In the final days of the war, Jackson commanded a ragtag army of regular troops, volunteers, enslaved men, and even pirates against an invading British force. On January 8, 1815, they delivered a stunning victory, killing over 2,000 British soldiers while suffering minimal American casualties. Although the war had technically ended weeks earlier with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, the news had not yet reached the United States. The battle was seen by Americans as a vindication of their independence and a triumph of courage over imperial might. Jackson emerged as a national hero, widely celebrated in newspapers, parades, and public ceremonies. His popularity spread beyond the South, reaching into the heart of the young American Republic. People admired his toughness, leadership, and connection to ordinary citizens. He became a living symbol of American determination and success in the face of adversity. Jackson's early life and military fame were deeply intertwined, each reinforcing his image as a man of the people. He came from humble beginnings and achieved greatness not through birth or privilege, but through grit, ambition, and sheer force of will. These traits made him an ideal figure for a nation in the midst of redefining its identity and its politics. His rise foreshadowed a new era in American democracy, one that would challenge old hierarchies and give voice to the growing power of the common man. The Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans was one of the most iconic military engagements in American history, not only for its remarkable outcome, but also for the way it transformed Andrew Jackson into a national hero. Fought on January 8, 1815, it was the final major battle of the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain. Ironically, it took place after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which officially ended the war, but because news traveled slowly across the Atlantic, neither side was aware that peace had already been achieved. The clash became a defining moment in American memory, symbolizing the country's resilience and military prowess. Andrew Jackson had been preparing for the defense of New Orleans for weeks. Aware of the strategic importance of the port city at the mouth of the Mississippi River, Jackson understood that its capture by British forces could cripple the United States economically and politically. He arrived in New Orleans in December 1814 and immediately began organizing a defensive force composed of regular Army troops, state militias, free black soldiers, Native American allies, and even pirates led by the infamous John Lafitte. Despite the ragtag nature of this diverse force, Jackson's leadership and ability to unite these groups under a common cause proved critical to the coming battle. The British, confident in their military superiority, launched an ambitious assault on the city, hoping for a swift victory. They sent over 8,000 well-trained troops under the command of General Edward Pakenham to take New Orleans. Jackson, outnumbered and outgunned, set up strong defensive positions on the plains below the city, constructing earthworks and barriers along the Rodriguez Canal. As the British advanced on the foggy morning of January 8th, they encountered withering fire from Jackson's entrenched defenders. American riflemen, artillery crews, and even local volunteers inflicted massive casualties on the attackers. The assault turned into a disaster for the British. General Pakenham was mortally wounded in the fight, and his men, facing relentless gunfire and confused by the terrain, were forced to retreat in chaos. In just under an hour, the British suffered over 2,000 casualties, including nearly 300 dead, while the Americans lost fewer than 100 men. The lopsided nature of the victory stunned observers on both sides and created a surge of patriotic pride in the United States. For Andrew Jackson, the battle was a turning point. Newspapers praised his leadership and courage, and ordinary citizens celebrated him as the man who saved the nation from a second British invasion. The victory at New Orleans was hailed as proof that the young republic could defend itself against even the most formidable European powers. Jackson's popularity skyrocketed, and he quickly became a figure of national importance, a symbol of the common man's strength and determination. The significance of the Battle of New Orleans went far beyond its military consequences. It helped solidify a distinct American identity and instilled a renewed sense of confidence in the country's future. For Jackson, it provided the foundation for his eventual rise to the presidency, where he would continue to champion the ideals of democracy and popular rule. The memory of the battle lingered in American culture for generations, a testament to the extraordinary power of unity, strategy, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The road to national recognition. Andrew Jackson's path to national recognition was paved by a combination of military triumph, political opportunity, and the growing hunger among ordinary Americans for leaders who reflected their values. After the stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson emerged from the War of 1812 as the most celebrated military figure in the country. The press hailed him as a savior of the Republic, and citizens across the expanding frontier admired his rugged image and no-nonsense leadership. But while battlefield glory provided the spark, it was Jackson's continued presence in public affairs and his ability to connect with a broad swath of the population that cemented his national stature. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Jackson remained active in military and territorial matters. He was appointed commander of U.S. forces in the southern region, where he clashed with Spanish authorities and native tribes in Florida. In 1818, he led an unauthorized military expedition into Spanish Florida, attacking Seminole villages and even seizing the Spanish fort at Pensacola. Though his actions drew criticism from some quarters in Washington, many Americans praised his decisive handling of the conflict. Jackson's aggressive tactics ultimately pressured Spain to cede Florida to the United States in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, a diplomatic success that further enhanced his image as a man who got results. The Florida campaign showed that Jackson was not only a skilled general, but also a powerful symbol of American expansionism. His willingness to defy diplomatic norms resonated with citizens who saw the frontier as a land of opportunity, one that should be secured and settled for the benefit of the nation. This expansionist mindset, tied to the growing belief in manifest destiny, found a perfect representative in Jackson. He was a living embodiment of the restless, ambitious spirit that defined the early 19th century American experience. Politically, Jackson's popularity grew steadily. He was nominated for the presidency in 1824 along with several other candidates, including John Quincy Adams, William H. Crawford, and Henry Clay. In a four-way race, Jackson won the most popular votes and electoral votes, but failed to secure a majority. The election was decided by the House of Representatives, where Clay, who had finished fourth, through his support behind Adams. When Adams won and appointed Clay as Secretary of State, Jackson's supporters denounced the outcome as a corrupt bargain. This perceived betrayal of the people's will only strengthened Jackson's political appeal. He began campaigning for the 1828 election almost immediately, now with the full backing of a growing and energized base. The road to national recognition also involved Jackson's careful cultivation of a new political identity. He and his allies cast him as a champion of the common man, an outsider to the elite circles of Washington, and a defender of the democratic spirit. His rugged background, military reputation, and disdain for aristocratic privilege made him an ideal candidate for a shifting electorate. Voters, particularly in the South and West, saw in Jackson someone who spoke their language and shared their values. By the late 1820s, Jackson was no longer just a war hero. He was a national figure poised to redefine American politics. His journey from orphaned frontier youth to the threshold of the presidency illustrated the dramatic social and political changes sweeping the country. As the tide of democracy continued to rise, Andrew Jackson stood ready to ride its wave to the highest office in the land. Chapter 2: Democracy Expands. The era of Andrew Jackson marked a significant transformation in American democracy as political participation widened and power began shifting away from the entrenched elites toward a broader segment of the population. This transformation did not happen overnight, but Jackson's rise to prominence symbolized the momentum of a growing democratic impulse that had been building since the founding of the Republic. By the 1820s, the country was undergoing profound political, social, and economic changes that challenged the old order and gave new voice to farmers, laborers, and settlers who had previously been left out of national decision-making. Jackson's presidency embodied the triumph of this movement, as it redefined what it meant to be a participant in American public life. One of the most important changes during this period was the expansion of voting rights. In the early years of the Republic, most states limited suffrage to white male property owners, a restriction that effectively excluded a large portion of the population. But by the 1820s, pressure was mounting to broaden access to the ballot. As new Western states entered the Union, many adopted more democratic constitutions that eliminated property requirements for voting. Older states followed suit, often in response to political activism and the rise of mass political parties that sought to mobilize voters. The result was a significant increase in voter participation, particularly among working-class white men who had previously been marginalized. This dramatic shift in the electorate helped fuel Jackson's 1828 campaign and contributed to his eventual victory. The election of 1828 was a landmark moment in the expansion of democracy. It was one of the first presidential elections in which the popular vote played a decisive role, and it saw unprecedented levels of voter turnout. Jackson's campaign capitalized on his image as a man of the people, a war hero who had risen from humble beginnings without the benefit of elite education or family connections. His supporters portrayed him as a true representative of the American spirit, in contrast to John Quincy Adams, who was seen as a symbol of aristocracy and privilege. The election itself was marked by intense personal attacks and a highly organized party structure laying the foundation for the modern campaign system. Beyond voting rights and electoral politics, Jacksonian democracy also influenced the structure and ideology of the American political system. Jackson and his followers believed that government should reflect the will of the majority, and they were suspicious of institutions they saw as undemocratic, such as the National Bank and the judiciary. Jackson's presidency was characterized by efforts to reduce the power of entrenched interests and to make government more responsive to the average citizen. While critics accused him of overreach and demagoguery, His administration fundamentally altered the expectations of what a president could do and who could wield political power. The expansion of democracy in the Jacksonian era was not without its contradictions. Women, Native Americans, and African Americans were still largely excluded from the political process. Yet for white men across the country, especially those in the new states and frontier regions, this period represented a dramatic opening of political opportunity. Jackson's presidency helped legitimize the idea that leadership should come from the people, not just the privileged few. It was a time when the voice of the majority began to assert itself more forcefully in American life, reshaping the nation's institutions and laying the groundwork for future struggles over inclusion and equality. The rise of the common man. The Jacksonian era heralded a profound change in American political life, defined by the ascendance of the common man as a central figure in national affairs. This shift reflected growing discontent with entrenched elites and a rising belief that government should serve the broader population, not just the wealthy and well-connected. Andrew Jackson, with his humble origins, fiery personality, and defiance of aristocratic norms, became the embodiment of this democratic spirit. His popularity was not merely the result of military victories or political maneuvering. It was deeply rooted in the cultural and social transformation sweeping across the country, where ordinary citizens began to assert their role in shaping the nation's destiny. In the decades following the American Revolution, the ideal of equality began to take on a new meaning. While the founding generation emphasized liberty and the rule of law, Jackson's time emphasized the idea that political power should rest with the people themselves. The frontier expansion of the early 19th century played a crucial role in this transformation. As settlers moved westward and carved out new communities, they brought with them a more egalitarian mindset, less beholden to traditional class structures. The new states that emerged often had more inclusive constitutions, eliminating property requirements for voting and encouraging broader political participation. These developments made the political landscape far more accessible to working-class white men who had previously been shut out of the process. Andrew Jackson capitalized on these changes like no one before him. He presented himself as one of the people, a self-made man who had risen through personal grit rather than inherited privilege. His background as a frontier lawyer, soldier, and planter resonated with Americans who had little in common with the educated, wealthy elites of the East. Jackson's blunt manner, distrust of centralized power, and fierce patriotism appealed to voters tired of what they saw as corruption and backroom deals in Washington. His 1828 campaign focused on building a broad coalition of farmers, laborers, and frontier settlers, emphasizing his identity as a true representative of the people's interests. Once in office, Jackson pursued policies that reflected his populist leanings. He challenged institutions that he believed favored the rich, most notably the Second Bank of the United States, which he saw as a tool of elite control. He also implemented the spoils system, arguing that rotating government jobs among loyal supporters democratized government service, though critics viewed it as a means of rewarding political allies. Still, these actions further strengthened his image as a leader willing to confront the establishment on behalf of ordinary Americans. The rise of the common man, however, was not universally inclusive. While white men without property were gaining new political rights, women, Native Americans, and African Americans remained disenfranchised and marginalized. Jacksonian democracy expanded access for some while reinforcing barriers for others. Nevertheless, the idea that political legitimacy came from the people, not privilege, became firmly embedded in the national consciousness. This period marked a turning point in American democracy, as political discourse shifted toward majority rule and mass participation. Jackson's presidency symbolized the arrival of a new kind of politics, one where charisma, public opinion, and personal connection mattered more than pedigree or pedigree. The rise of the common man was not just a slogan. It was a movement that redefined what it meant to be American, and who had the right to shape the country's future. Changes in voting rights. During the Jacksonian era, the United States experienced a dramatic transformation in its political system, most notably in the expansion of voting rights. The early years of the Republic had been characterized by a restricted electorate, where property ownership and wealth were often prerequisites for participation in elections. These limitations reflected the belief among the founding generation that political power should rest in the hands of those with a vested interest in society's stability and prosperity. But by the 1820s and 1830s, those assumptions were being challenged by a rising tide of democratic ideals. The growing population of working-class white men, particularly in the expanding Western territories, demanded a voice in the political process. Their demands led to significant changes in state laws and voting practices that redefined who could be part of the American democracy. At the heart of these changes was the removal of property qualifications for voting. Many states, especially those in the West, had never imposed such requirements, viewing them as barriers to a truly representative government. As these states entered the Union, they helped set a new standard for inclusivity. In response, older Eastern states began revising their constitutions and laws to align with the broader trend, often due to public pressure and the influence of growing political movements that championed the rights of ordinary citizens. By the end of the 1830s, most states had eliminated property requirements for white male voters, resulting in a significant increase in the size and diversity of the electorate. This expansion of suffrage played a crucial role in Andrew Jackson's political rise. His supporters, many of whom were newly enfranchised voters, saw him as a symbol of their empowerment. Jackson's identity as a self-made man and his campaign's emphasis on popular participation resonated deeply with the emerging democratic spirit of the age. His 1828 presidential campaign was one of the first to truly mobilize the masses, using rallies, newspapers, and local party organizations to engage voters on a national scale. The election became a celebration of the people's will, in contrast to the elite-driven politics that had dominated previous decades. Despite these advancements, the new democratic era did not extend political rights to everyone. Women, African Americans, and Native Americans remained excluded from the expanding democratic process. In some states, free Black men who had once been allowed to vote saw their rights revoked during this period, a reflection of the racial hierarchies that continued to shape American society. While Jacksonian democracy widened access to the ballot for many white men, it did so at the cost of reinforcing other forms of exclusion and inequality. The notion of the common man was limited by race and gender, even as it claimed to represent broader democratic ideals. Nonetheless, the changes in voting rights during the Jacksonian era laid the groundwork for future expansions of democracy. The idea that government should reflect the will of the people became more firmly entrenched in American political culture. Voter participation surged, political parties evolved to accommodate mass involvement, and elections took on a new level of significance. These developments marked a turning point in the nation's political history, as voting became not just a privilege for the few, but a fundamental expression of citizenship for many. The 1828 election and its impact. The election of 1828 was a watershed moment in American political history, representing not only the triumph of Andrew Jackson, but also a dramatic shift in how politics functioned in the United States. This election marked the rise of a new democratic era, where mass political participation and populist rhetoric reshaped the relationship between the government and its citizens. It was a contest not just between two men, but between two very different visions of America. On one side stood John Quincy Adams, the sitting president, a Harvard-educated son of a founding father who represented the established political elite. On the other side stood Andrew Jackson, a military hero and self-made man who claimed to represent the interests of ordinary Americans. The campaign leading up to the election was one of the most vicious in American history. Both sides engaged in relentless personal attacks. Jackson's opponents accused him of being a hot-tempered tyrant, an adulterer, and a backwoods brute unfit for high office. Adams's allies spread rumors and published pamphlets attacking Jackson's wife, Rachel, for their allegedly scandalous marriage, causing her significant emotional distress. In response, Jackson's supporters painted Adams as an aloof aristocrat who had secured the presidency in 1824 through a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay. These deeply personal and often slanderous tactics stirred intense public interest, drawing voters into a heated and emotional political fight. At the heart of the election was the question of who should hold power in the Republic. Jackson campaigned as the champion of the common man, promising to restore the government to the people and break the grip of entrenched interests. He benefited from the recent expansion of voting rights, as many states had eliminated property qualifications for white male voters. This allowed millions of new voters to participate in national politics for the first time, and Jackson's message of inclusion and empowerment struck a powerful chord. His campaign pioneered the use of organized rallies, partisan newspapers, and coordinated local committees to build support across a wide geographic area. When the votes were counted, Jackson won a decisive victory, carrying a large majority of both the popular and electoral votes. His election was seen as a rebuke of elite political control and a validation of popular sovereignty. For many Americans, especially those in the South and West, Jackson's rise to power symbolized the beginning of a more democratic and responsive government. However, for others, especially in the Northeast and among the political class, it signaled a dangerous shift toward populism and mob rule. The impact of the 1828 election was felt immediately and profoundly. Jackson's presidency ushered in what became known as the Age of Jackson, characterized by expanded political participation, a stronger executive branch, and growing tensions over issues like federal power, banking, and Native American policy. The election also marked the solidification of the two-party system, with Jackson's supporters forming the core of what would become the Democratic Party. Future campaigns would follow the model established in 1828, relying on emotional appeals, mass mobilization, and a direct connection between candidates and voters. The 1828 election reshaped American democracy. It brought millions into the political process, redefined the role of the presidency, and demonstrated the power of popular will. Its legacy endures as a turning point where the voice of the people began to more directly influence the course of the nation. Chapter 3: Jacksonian Politics. Andrew Jackson's presidency marked a significant transformation in American political life, giving rise to what became known as Jacksonian democracy. At its core, this new political philosophy centered on the belief that government should be more responsive to the will of the people, especially to the growing population of white male voters who had recently gained the right to vote. Jackson positioned himself as a defender of the common man, and his administration aimed to dismantle systems and institutions that were seen as corrupt or elitist. His leadership style, bold and unyielding, redefined the presidency and set new precedents for executive power, political party organization, and federal authority. One of the hallmarks of Jacksonian politics was a commitment to broadening participation in government, at least for a specific segment of the population. Jackson distrusted entrenched elites and believed that ordinary citizens were fully capable of managing public affairs. This belief helped justify the implementation of the spoils system, in which political supporters were rewarded with government jobs. Jackson argued that rotating officials in and out of office prevented corruption and ensured that government remained connected to the people it served. Critics, however, saw this as a way to fill public offices with unqualified loyalists, leading to inefficiency and patronage-driven corruption. Still, the spoils system became a defining feature of Jacksonian governance, reinforcing the idea that politics was no longer just the domain of the privileged few. Jackson also revolutionized presidential power through his frequent and assertive use of the veto. Prior presidents had used the veto power sparingly, typically reserving it for cases of constitutional conflict. Jackson, however, employed the veto as a political tool, striking down legislation he believed was harmful or misaligned with the interests of the people. The most famous example was his veto of the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson viewed the bank as a symbol of concentrated financial power and a threat to democracy, arguing that it favored wealthy investors at the expense of ordinary Americans. His veto message laid out a vision of the presidency as the direct voice of the people, challenging Congress and reshaping the balance of power within the federal government. The political landscape under Jackson also saw the rise of a more organized and active party system. The Democratic Party, under Jackson's leadership, became a powerful force, uniting farmers, laborers, and frontier settlers under a common banner. Opponents of Jackson, alarmed by his concentration of power and populist tactics, formed the Whig Party in response. This two-party rivalry introduced a new level of competition and energy to American politics, with each side vying for mass support and control of public opinion. Despite its claims to democratic expansion, Jacksonian politics excluded large portions of the population. Women, Native Americans, and African Americans remained disenfranchised or were actively oppressed during Jackson's presidency. Policies such as the Indian Removal Act contradicted the administration's stated commitment to liberty and fairness, revealing the limitations and contradictions of Jackson's vision. Nevertheless, Jacksonian politics redefined how Americans viewed their government. It brought new energy and participation into the political system and changed the role of the president in ways that would endure for generations. The era challenged traditional structures, empowered a broader electorate, and laid the foundation for a more engaged and contentious political culture. The spoils system. The spoils system became one of the most controversial features of Andrew Jackson's presidency and a defining characteristic of Jacksonian democracy. At its core, the spoils system involved rewarding political supporters with government jobs, replacing previous office holders who were often long-serving and experienced, but seen by Jackson as representatives of a political elite. Jackson believed that regular turnover in government positions was a democratic necessity, preventing entrenchment of power and encouraging broader participation in public life. This practice dramatically altered how political appointments were handled and changed the relationship between political parties and the federal government. Jackson's justification for the spoils system was rooted in his belief that government should belong to the people, not an elite class of bureaucrats. He viewed public office not as a lifelong career, but as a temporary service role that any honest and capable citizen could perform. This perspective aligned with the broader goals of Jacksonian democracy, which sought to dismantle aristocratic influence and elevate the role of the average white man in government. Upon taking office, Jackson quickly moved to replace hundreds of federal employees with loyalists, arguing that such action was necessary to restore the government's responsiveness and integrity. Supporters of the spoils system praised it as a means of democratizing government. They argued that rotating office holders prevented corruption by ensuring that no single group or class could monopolize power. It also offered opportunities to individuals from modest backgrounds who had previously been excluded from public service. For many Jacksonians, the system symbolized the dismantling of elitism and the realization of political equality, at least for white men. However, critics were quick to denounce the spoils system as political cronyism. They argued that it prioritized loyalty over competence, resulting in the appointment of individuals who lacked the experience or qualifications necessary for effective governance. Many feared that it fostered corruption and inefficiency as public offices became prizes for partisan loyalty rather than instruments of public service. Jackson's opponents claimed that the system undermined the meritocratic ideals of the Republic and led to the degradation of public administration. The spoils system also had long-term consequences for the structure of American politics. It deepened the connection between party loyalty and public employment, effectively tying government service to political allegiance. This created an incentive for citizens to align with political machines, knowing that support during elections could be rewarded with a job. As political parties grew more organized and powerful, the distribution of government positions became an essential part of political strategy. Future presidents from both parties would adopt the spoils system to some extent, leading to a deeply politicized federal workforce that persisted for decades. By institutionalizing patronage, the spoils system helped solidify the role of mass political parties in American democracy. It expanded access to government for many who had previously been shut out, while simultaneously raising questions about the balance between democratic participation and administrative competence. Though eventually curbed by civil service reforms in the late 19th century, the spoils system's legacy remains an important chapter in the evolution of American political practice. It illustrated both the strengths and weaknesses of Jacksonian ideals, showing how efforts to promote equality and inclusion could sometimes clash with the need for professional and impartial governance. The Bank War. The Bank War was one of the most defining and dramatic conflicts of Andrew Jackson's presidency, symbolizing his deep distrust of concentrated financial power and his fierce defense of what he believed to be democratic principles. At the center of the controversy was the Second Bank of the United States, a federally chartered institution that acted as the government's fiscal agent and held vast influence over the nation's economy. While the bank had powerful supporters in Congress and among the business elite, Jackson viewed it as a dangerous monopoly that served the wealthy at the expense of ordinary Americans. His campaign to destroy the bank became a political and ideological battle that reshaped the nation's financial system and tested the limits of presidential authority. The Second Bank had been created in 1816 to stabilize the economy following the financial disarray of the War of 1812. Under the leadership of Nicholas Biddle, the bank became a central institution in managing the nation's credit, regulating currency, and restraining reckless lending by smaller state banks. To many in the business community, it represented financial discipline and economic growth. But to Jackson and his supporters, the bank was an unelected, unaccountable body that held too much power over the people's money. They believed it favored Eastern elites, manipulated credit for political purposes, and posed a threat to the democratic order. The conflict came to a head in 1832 when Congress passed a bill to renew the bank's charter, which was not set to expire until 1836. The move was orchestrated by bank supporters, including Senator Henry Clay, who hoped to use Jackson's opposition to the bank as a political weapon in the upcoming presidential election. Jackson responded by vetoing the recharter bill, issuing a forceful message that framed the bank as incompatible with American values. He argued that the institution concentrated too much economic power in too few hands and violated the principle of equality under the law. His veto was not just a rejection of the bill, it was a bold assertion of executive power and a declaration of his vision for the Republic. Jackson's veto was popular among his base, and he went on to win re-election in 1832 by a wide margin. Emboldened by this victory, he escalated the conflict by ordering the removal of federal deposits from the bank, placing them instead in selected state banks, often referred to as pet banks. This action, taken without congressional approval, triggered a constitutional crisis and led to a Senate censure of Jackson, the first and only time a sitting president was formally censured by the Senate. Nicholas Biddle responded by tightening credit and calling in loans, hoping to create economic instability that would force Jackson to back down. But the public largely sided with Jackson, and the bank's influence gradually diminished as its charter expired. The bank war had lasting consequences. In the short term, it contributed to economic volatility, including a speculative boom followed by the Panic of 1837. In the long run, it altered the balance of power between the branches of government and reinforced the president's role as a direct representative of the people. It also marked a turning point in the debate over economic policy and federal authority, illustrating the fierce tensions between democracy and capitalism that would continue to shape American politics. Jackson's use of presidential power. Andrew Jackson's presidency marked a dramatic shift in the role and power of the American executive branch. Throughout his time in office, Jackson redefined the presidency by expanding its influence and utilizing it as a direct tool for executing his policies. Jackson's approach to presidential power was rooted in his belief that the president should serve as the direct representative of the people, challenging the notion that the government should be controlled by an elite few. His leadership style was characterized by decisive action, often bypassing traditional checks and balances, which led to both admiration and criticism. Jackson's assertive use of power set a new precedent for future presidents and helped shape the modern American presidency. One of the clearest examples of Jackson's expansive view of presidential authority was his frequent use of the veto. Unlike his predecessors, who reserved the veto for issues related to constitutional interpretation, Jackson used the veto as a political tool to challenge laws he believed were harmful to the interests of the common people. His veto of the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States in 1832 was perhaps the most famous example. Jackson believed the bank was a monopoly that concentrated too much economic power in the hands of a few elites, undermining the democratic principles of the republic. His veto not only blocked the renewal of the bank's charter, but also set the stage for a confrontation with Congress over the limits of executive power. Jackson's veto message was a bold assertion of presidential authority, in which he argued that the president had a right to veto bills based on their perceived fairness to the people, not just their constitutionality. Jackson also used his executive power to reshape the federal bureaucracy. Through the implementation of the spoils system, Jackson removed many government employees from office and replaced them with loyal supporters. He argued that this would prevent corruption by rotating office holders and ensuring that the government reflected the will of the people. Critics, however, saw this as a way to reward political allies and to fill positions with individuals who were often unqualified for the tasks at hand. Despite the controversy, Jackson's practice of rewarding loyalists became a lasting feature of American politics, further consolidating the president's control over the executive branch. Another significant example of Jackson's assertive use of power came during the nullification crisis. When South Carolina declared that it would not obey federal tariffs, Jackson responded forcefully, emphasizing the supremacy of the federal government. He threatened military action and pushed Congress to pass the Force Bill, which granted him the authority to use the military to enforce federal laws. Jackson's willingness to use such extreme measures to preserve the Union demonstrated his commitment to a strong federal government and set a precedent for future presidents dealing with regional challenges. Jackson's presidency also saw the expansion of the executive branch's influence in foreign policy. His approach to diplomacy was marked by a willingness to take bold, sometimes unilateral actions, as seen in his handling of foreign relations with Britain and Spain. In particular, his military actions in Florida, which led to the acquisition of the territory from Spain, exemplified his use of executive power to further national interests, even without explicit congressional approval. Jackson's use of presidential power fundamentally altered the dynamics of American government. His presidency emphasized the centralization of power in the executive branch, laying the groundwork for the modern presidency. While his methods were often controversial, they underscored the growing importance of the president as a national figure and a key player in both domestic and foreign affairs. Jackson's actions made clear that the presidency was not just an office to execute the laws, but an institution capable of shaping the course of the nation. Chapter 4: Conflict and Controversy. Andrew Jackson's presidency was marked by a series of conflicts and controversies that not only defined his time in office, but also shaped the future direction of American politics. While Jackson was a popular figure among many, especially those who supported his vision of a stronger democracy for the common man, his actions and policies often sparked fierce opposition. These disputes highlighted the deepening divisions in the country, particularly over issues such as states' rights, federal authority, and the role of the government in regulating the economy. Jackson's presidency was, in many ways, a battle over the power of the federal government versus the rights of individual states and citizens. One of the most significant controversies of Jackson's presidency was the nullification crisis of 1832 to 1833. This crisis was triggered by South Carolina's decision to declare that it would not enforce the federal tariff laws, which they viewed as harmful to their economy. South Carolina argued that individual states had the right to nullify or ignore federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. Jackson, a staunch advocate of federal authority, was unwilling to allow any state to defy the national government. He responded forcefully, issuing a proclamation that condemned South Carolina's actions and reaffirmed the supremacy of federal law. Jackson also requested the passage of the Force Bill, which authorized him to use military force if necessary to ensure compliance with federal tariffs. While the crisis was eventually resolved peacefully through a compromise negotiated by Henry Clay, the nullification crisis highlighted the tensions between the federal government and states' rights that would continue to simmer in the coming decades. Another major point of contention during Jackson's presidency was his aggressive stance on Native American removal. One of his most controversial actions was the signing of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands to designated Indian territory west of the Mississippi River. Jackson argued that the removal was necessary to protect Native American tribes from encroaching white settlers and to open up land for farming and expansion. However, critics saw this as an unjust policy that violated the rights of Native peoples and subjected them to inhumane treatment. The most infamous event of the removal process was the Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Cherokee Creek and other tribes were forced to march westward under brutal conditions, leading to the deaths of many. The policy caused a lasting rift between Jackson and many of his political opponents, who viewed it as an overreach of executive power and a moral wrong. The Bank War also represented a major source of controversy during Jackson's time in office. Jackson's crusade against the Second Bank of the United States was rooted in his belief that the institution wielded too much economic power and favored the rich at the expense of ordinary Americans. In 1832, Jackson vetoed the recharter of the bank, and in the following years, he ordered the removal of federal deposits from the bank, transferring them to state-chartered banks. These actions, though popular with his supporters, sparked outrage among the bank's defenders, who saw Jackson's moves as a threat to financial stability. The political battle over the bank deepened divisions in the country, with Jackson's opponents accusing him of overreaching his powers and threatening economic ruin. Jackson's presidency was marked by a series of conflicts that highlighted his strong convictions and his willingness to challenge established institutions. While his policies won him the loyalty of many who believed in his populist vision, they also alienated numerous political elites and sparked fierce resistance. These controversies, particularly regarding the balance of power between the federal government and the states, as well as his treatment of Native Americans, would shape American political discourse for decades to come. Jackson's legacy, though celebrated by many, remains a subject of debate and criticism, reflecting the complexities of his leadership and the divisive nature of the issues he faced. The Nullification Crisis. The Nullification Crisis of 1832 to 1833 was one of the most significant and contentious moments in Andrew Jackson's presidency. It was a political confrontation between the federal government and the state of South Carolina that tested the limits of states' rights and the power of the presidency. At the heart of the crisis was South Carolina's objection to federal tariffs, particularly the Tariff of 1828, which they believed unfairly favored northern industries at the expense of southern economies, which were largely dependent on agriculture and trade. South Carolina's response to the tariff was to declare that they would not enforce it within their borders, asserting their right to nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. The crisis set the stage for a broader debate over the nature of federalism and the balance of power between the states and the federal government. South Carolina's nullification of the tariff laws was a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government. In 1832, after the tariff had been revised but still failed to meet South Carolina's demands, the state legislature convened a special convention that passed an ordinance declaring the tariff unconstitutional and unenforceable within the state. This action was grounded in the doctrine of nullification, which argued that individual states had the right to reject federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. The idea of nullification was based on the premise that the states, as sovereign entities, had voluntarily joined the Union and therefore had the right to determine the validity of federal laws. The doctrine had roots in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798, which had been written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. President Jackson, a staunch Unionist, vehemently opposed the idea of nullification. He believed that the survival of the Union was paramount, and he saw the South Carolina action as a dangerous precedent that could lead to the dissolution of the country. Jackson's response to the nullification crisis was swift and firm. He issued a proclamation to the people of South Carolina, declaring that nullification was incompatible with the Constitution and the survival of the Union. He argued that the Union was perpetual and that no state had the right to unilaterally nullify federal law. Jackson's rhetoric was forceful, and he warned South Carolina that secession would lead to war. To further demonstrate his commitment to preserving the Union, Jackson also requested that Congress pass the Force Bill, which would authorize him to use military force to enforce federal laws in South Carolina, if necessary. Despite Jackson's strong stance, the crisis was ultimately resolved peacefully. In 1833, after intense political pressure, a compromise was brokered by Senator Henry Clay. The compromise tariff of 1833 gradually reduced the tariffs that had been the source of South Carolina's dissatisfaction, while South Carolina agreed to repeal its nullification ordinance. Jackson's commitment to federal authority, combined with the compromise, diffused the immediate threat of a confrontation. However, the underlying tensions over states' rights and the power of the federal government were far from resolved. The nullification crisis marked a turning point in the relationship between the federal government and the states. While Jackson's firm response helped preserve the Union and assert the supremacy of federal law, it also deepened the divisions between the North and South, particularly over issues like slavery and states' rights. Jackson's actions reinforced the idea that the president, as the representative of the people, had the authority to act decisively to protect the Union, even if it meant confronting states that challenged federal authority. However, the crisis foreshadowed the ongoing conflict between federal power and states' rights that would eventually culminate in the Civil War. Jackson's handling of the nullification crisis solidified his reputation as a staunch defender of the Union, but it also exposed the deep ideological rifts that would continue to divide the nation. The role of Vice President Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, who served as Andrew Jackson's vice president during the first term of his presidency, played a significant and often contentious role in the political landscape of the Jacksonian era. Calhoun, a staunch advocate for states' rights and a prominent figure in the South, found himself at odds with Jackson over a variety of issues, most notably the nullification crisis. While Calhoun had initially been a strong supporter of Jackson, their relationship soured as their ideological differences grew, particularly over the question of federal power versus states' rights. Calhoun's role in Jackson's administration was marked by a series of political battles that ultimately led to his resignation as vice president and his lasting influence on the debates surrounding the Union and states' rights. Calhoun began his political career as a strong nationalist, advocating for a powerful federal government and supporting policies that promoted national unity, such as internal improvements and protective tariffs. However, by the early 1820s, his views began to shift, particularly in response to the growing influence of Northern industrial interests in American politics. Calhoun became increasingly sympathetic to the South's economic interests and began to champion the rights of states to reject federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. This shift in his political ideology would come to define his role in Jackson's administration and the nullification crisis that erupted in the early 1830s. The conflict between Jackson and Calhoun came to a head over the issue of the Tariff of 1828, which Southern states, including South Carolina, viewed as unfairly benefiting the North at the expense of the South. Calhoun, who was serving as vice president at the time, secretly authored the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which argued that states had the right to nullify federal laws they found unconstitutional. This document laid the intellectual groundwork for the doctrine of nullification, which Calhoun would later champion during the nullification crisis. Jackson, on the other hand, saw the tariff as a necessary means of protecting American industries, and he strongly opposed any efforts to challenge the authority of the federal government. As tensions between Jackson and Calhoun grew over the issue of nullification, their personal relationship deteriorated. Calhoun's outspoken advocacy for states' rights put him at odds with Jackson's belief in a strong and unified federal government. The situation was further complicated by the personal dynamics within the Jackson administration, particularly the so-called Peggy Eaton affair, which centered on a social scandal involving members of Jackson's cabinet and their wives. Calhoun's wife, Floride, was one of the leaders of the opposition to Peggy Eaton, and the dispute led to a breakdown in relationships within the administration, exacerbating the rift between Jackson and Calhoun. The crisis reached its climax in 1832 when South Carolina declared that it would not enforce the federal tariff laws, invoking the doctrine of nullification. Jackson responded forcefully, issuing a proclamation that rejected the idea of nullification and reaffirmed the supremacy of federal law. Calhoun, who had previously championed the nullification doctrine, found himself in a difficult position. His loyalty to his home state of South Carolina clashed with his role as vice president, and the crisis ultimately led to his resignation from office in 1832. Calhoun's resignation was a significant moment in American political history, as it marked the first time a vice president voluntarily resigned due to a political conflict with the president. After resigning, Calhoun returned to South Carolina, where he would continue to be a leading advocate for states' rights and slavery. His political career did not end with his resignation. Instead, he went on to serve as a U.S. Senator from South Carolina, where he continued to play a pivotal role in the debates over the expansion of slavery and the South's relationship with the Union. Calhoun's influence would continue to shape Southern politics for years to come, especially as tensions over states' rights and slavery ultimately led to the Civil War. John C. Calhoun's role as vice president under Andrew Jackson was marked by significant ideological and personal conflict. His advocacy for states' rights and his leadership during the nullification crisis helped define his political legacy and cemented his position as one of the most influential figures in the pre-Civil War South. Despite his resignation, Calhoun remained a powerful voice in American politics, particularly in defense of Southern interests, and his ideas about states' rights would continue to reverberate throughout the country for decades. State versus federal authority. The issue of state versus federal authority was one of the most contentious and divisive topics in American politics during Andrew Jackson's presidency. At the heart of this debate was the question of who should hold ultimate power in the United States, the individual states or the federal government. This debate was not new, but Jackson's presidency brought it into sharp focus, particularly during the nullification crisis of 1832 to 1833, when South Carolina attempted to assert its right to nullify federal laws. The crisis underscored the growing tension between the concept of federal supremacy, as embodied by Jackson, and the principle of states' rights, championed by leaders like John C. Calhoun. Jackson, like many of his contemporaries, believed in a strong federal government that could preserve the Union and ensure national stability. He saw the United States as a unified republic where laws passed by the federal government should be supreme over the laws of individual states. Jackson's firm belief in federal authority was rooted in the idea that the survival of the nation depended on maintaining a central, cohesive government that could act decisively in times of crisis. This view was particularly important during the nullification crisis, when South Carolina declared it would not enforce federal tariffs, arguing that states had the right to nullify federal laws they found unconstitutional. Jackson rejected this argument outright, claiming that no state had the right to override federal law, and he took steps to prevent any state from seceding from the Union. Jackson's opposition to states' rights was based on his vision of national unity and the idea that federal authority should be able to address issues that affected the entire nation. He saw the federal government as a necessary force for preserving order and ensuring that all states followed the same set of laws. His response to South Carolina's challenge was firm and decisive. He issued a proclamation declaring the nullification doctrine unconstitutional and called on Congress to pass the force bill, which would give him the authority to use military force to enforce federal laws in South Carolina. Jackson's response was a clear demonstration of his commitment to maintaining federal authority, even at the risk of military conflict. However, not everyone shared Jackson's belief in a strong federal government. South Carolina and many other states in the South believed that states had the right to decide what was best for their own citizens, particularly on issues such as tariffs and slavery. These states argued that the federal government should not have the power to impose laws that they saw as detrimental to their economies and way of life. This view was based on the doctrine of states' rights, which held that states had the power to nullify federal laws that they deemed unconstitutional. Leaders like Calhoun advocated for this principle, believing that the states, as sovereign entities, should have the final say on matters of policy that affected them directly. The nullification crisis ultimately ended without bloodshed, largely due to a compromise tariff that lowered the rates and a temporary de-escalation of tensions. However, the conflict highlighted the deep divisions in the country over the balance of power between the federal government and the states. While Jackson's firm stance against nullification reinforced the idea of federal supremacy, it also deepened the rift between the North and South, particularly over issues like slavery and economic policies. The crisis foreshadowed the ongoing struggles over states' rights that would continue to dominate American politics in the years leading up to the Civil War. The state versus federal authority debate did not end with the nullification crisis, but Jackson's handling of it set a precedent for future presidents. His firm belief in federal authority and the idea that the Union must be preserved at all costs became a hallmark of his presidency. Jackson's stance on this issue would continue to shape political discourse in America, as the balance between state power and federal power remained a central issue throughout the nation's history. Chapter 5: Native American Displacement. Native American displacement during Andrew Jackson's presidency represents one of the darkest chapters in American history. The forced removal of Native tribes from their ancestral lands, often referred to as the Trail of Tears, was a direct result of Jackson's policies, most notably the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Jackson's stance toward Native Americans was shaped by his belief that their land was needed for American expansion and that their assimilation into white society was not feasible. The Indian Removal Act, passed under his administration, authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties with Native tribes to relocate them west of the Mississippi River, opening up their lands for white settlement. What followed was the systematic and tragic removal of thousands of Native Americans, a process that caused immense suffering and loss. Jackson viewed the removal of Native tribes as a necessary policy for the progress of the United States. He believed that relocating the tribes to the Western territories would protect them from the encroaching pressures of white settlers and ensure their survival in a rapidly changing world. He also argued that by moving the tribes to less fertile lands, he could allow for the expansion of American agriculture, especially cotton, without the burden of conflicting interests. Jackson's policy was deeply influenced by the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the continent. In his view, this expansion was not just inevitable but righteous, and Native Americans stood in the way of the nation's progress. However, the reality of Jackson's Indian removal policy was far from the idealized vision of peace and prosperity for Native Americans. The removal process was neither voluntary nor fair. The federal government used treaties to pressure tribes into surrendering their lands, often under duress, and offered little in return. When some tribes, such as the Cherokee, resisted, the government resorted to force. The most notorious example of this resistance was the forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation in 1838, known as the Trail of Tears. After years of legal battles, including a landmark Supreme Court case, Worcester v. Georgia, which ruled in favor of the Cherokees' right to remain on their land, Jackson defied the court and proceeded with the removal. The Cherokee were forced to march over 1,000 miles to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, enduring harsh conditions, disease, and inadequate supplies. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee died during the journey. The Trail of Tears was not an isolated incident. Other tribes, including the Creek, Choctaw, and Seminole, were also subjected to forced removals, often facing similar hardships. The Choctaw were the first to be removed, beginning their journey in 1831, and they too suffered greatly from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The Seminole tribe, in contrast, resisted removal and fought in the Seminole Wars, but were eventually driven out after years of conflict. Jackson's policy of Native American removal faced strong opposition from various quarters. Missionaries, human rights advocates, and some members of Congress spoke out against the policy, condemning it as cruel and unjust. However, Jackson's political power, particularly his popularity among Southern and Western voters, allowed him to press forward with the removals. The policy was supported by many white Americans who saw it as a way to gain land for agriculture and settlement, which in turn contributed to the expanding economy of the South and the rise of cotton as a dominant crop. The long-term effects of Native American displacement were devastating. Entire cultures were uprooted, and many tribes lost their ancestral homelands and way of life. The legacy of Jackson's Indian removal policies would continue to affect Native communities for generations. The relocation was not just a physical displacement, but also a cultural and spiritual one. Native Americans were forced to adapt to new environments and circumstances, leading to lasting trauma and disruption of their social structures. Jackson's Indian removal policy remains a deeply controversial aspect of his presidency and is viewed by many as a tragic injustice that irreparably harmed the indigenous peoples of the United States. The Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was one of the most significant and controversial pieces of legislation during Andrew Jackson's presidency. The act authorized the president to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes in the southeastern United States, enabling their forced relocation to lands west of the Mississippi River, an area designated as Indian Territory. Jackson believed that removal was the best solution for both the Native American tribes and for the expansion of the United States. He argued that relocation would protect Native Americans from the encroaching white settlers, prevent conflict, and allow the tribes to maintain their way of life in a less hostile environment. However, the policy led to the brutal and tragic displacement of thousands of Native Americans, with consequences that are still felt today. Jackson's rationale for the Indian Removal Act was rooted in the idea that Native Americans could not coexist with the growing population of settlers in the East. As settlers pushed westward, they demanded more land for farming and development, particularly in the fertile lands of the Southeast, where tribes such as the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw lived. Jackson, echoing the sentiment of many white Americans, believed that the Native Americans should be moved to less valuable land in the West, where they could live without interfering with American expansion. He framed the removal as a benevolent act that would spare Native American tribes from the violence and oppression they would face as settlers encroached upon their land. The Indian Removal Act passed through Congress largely due to Jackson's political influence and the growing sentiment in the South and West in favor of expansion. The legislation gave Jackson the authority to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes, offering them land in the West in exchange for their eastern territories. Jackson's administration made use of these treaties, often pressuring tribes into signing under duress or with promises that were rarely fulfilled. However, the reality of the removal process was far from Jackson's assurances. Many tribes resisted the policy, including the Cherokee, who had adopted many aspects of European American culture, including a written language and a legal system. In 1832, the Cherokee Nation took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that the Cherokee had a right to their land. Jackson, however, famously ignored the court's ruling, and the forced removal continued, culminating in the infamous Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Cherokee people died from disease, starvation, and exhaustion as they were forced to march westward. The Indian Removal Act stands as one of the most devastating policies in American history, causing immense suffering and loss for Native American communities. While Jackson believed it was a necessary step for the nation's growth, the act resulted in the destruction of Native American cultures and the loss of their ancestral lands. The legacy of the Indian Removal Act is a painful reminder of the brutal consequences of America's westward expansion. The Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears refers to the forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation and other Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, during the 1830s. This event, which was a direct result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, stands as one of the darkest chapters in American history. It symbolizes the brutal and inhumane treatment of Native Americans by the U.S. government, particularly under President Andrew Jackson's administration, whose policies led to the displacement and suffering of thousands of indigenous people. The Cherokee were one of the most affected tribes by the forced relocation. Despite their attempts to assimilate into American society by adopting many of the practices of white settlers, such as forming a written language, building schools, and creating a constitution. The U.S. government viewed them and other native tribes as obstacles to westward expansion. The Cherokee, particularly, resisted the forced relocation, taking their case to the U.S. Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia, 1832. The court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, affirming their right to remain on their land. However, President Jackson, famously disregarding the ruling, stated, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." This defiance paved the way for the implementation of the Indian removal policy. In 1838, the U.S. government began the removal process, forcibly rounding up the Cherokee and other tribes and marching them westward. The journey became known as the Trail of Tears due to the severe conditions the Native Americans faced. The tribes were given little food, water, or medical supplies, and were forced to walk thousands of miles through harsh weather, muddy roads, and unfamiliar terrain. During the journey, thousands of men, women, and children died from exhaustion, disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The Cherokee alone lost approximately 4,000 of their people during the forced relocation. The Trail of Tears was not an isolated event, as other tribes, including the Choctaw, Creek, and Chickasaw, were also forcibly removed from their lands under similar conditions. The policy of relocation was driven by the desire to open up fertile land for cotton cultivation and American settlers, with little regard for the lives and cultures of the native peoples. The legacy of the Trail of Tears remains a painful reminder of the U.S. government's systematic mistreatment of Native American tribes. It marked the beginning of a long history of injustice and trauma that Native Americans would continue to face, as their lands were taken, cultures were decimated, and their sovereignty was undermined. The Trail of Tears stands as a symbol of the brutal costs of American expansion and the devastating consequences for the indigenous populations. Resistance and survival. Despite the overwhelming force of the U.S. government's policies, many Native American tribes resisted the forced relocation and worked tirelessly to survive in the face of immense hardship. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the subsequent Trail of Tears were not the end of Native American resistance, but rather the beginning of a struggle for survival that would span many years. Resistance took many forms, from legal battles to armed conflict, as Native Americans sought to protect their land, culture, and way of life against the relentless push of American expansion. One of the most notable forms of resistance came from the Cherokee Nation, who, despite being forced to relocate, had initially fought the removal through legal means. The Cherokees' legal battle culminated in the 1832 Supreme Court case Worcester, Georgia, where Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of the Cherokee, recognizing their sovereign rights. However, President Andrew Jackson famously ignored the court's decision, and the forced removal proceeded. Despite the court's ruling, the Cherokee continued to resist the relocation for as long as possible, holding on to their land and their sovereignty, even as they faced pressure from the federal government. Other tribes also resisted removal through armed conflict. The Seminole of Florida are perhaps the most famous example of resistance through armed struggle. Led by the powerful leader Osceola, the Seminole fought in the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, which became one of the longest and most costly wars in U.S. history. Though they fought valiantly, the Seminoles were eventually forced to retreat to the swamps of Florida, where they continued to resist for years. However, their refusal to give up their land and their eventual survival in the Florida Everglades became a symbol of resilience. For many Native American tribes, survival was not just about resistance, but also adaptation. After the brutal journey of the Trail of Tears, those who managed to survive faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives in unfamiliar territories. Some tribes, like the Cherokee, sought to rebuild their communities by adopting some aspects of Western culture, including farming techniques and governance structures, while also maintaining their cultural traditions. Despite the overwhelming odds, many Native groups were able to preserve parts of their cultural identity, language, and traditions, passing them down through generations. Survival for Native Americans during this period was not just physical, but also cultural. Even as they were displaced and their lands taken, their resistance ensured that their stories and their identity endured. The resistance and survival of Native American tribes during this tumultuous period laid the foundation for their continued fight for justice and recognition in the years that followed. The legacy of their perseverance is still evident today, as Native American communities continue to preserve their cultures and assert their rights in the face of ongoing challenges. Chapter 6: Society in Transition. The Jacksonian era marked a period of profound social, economic, and cultural change in the United States. As the country expanded westward and industrialized, American society underwent significant transformations. These changes were driven by a combination of technological advancements, shifts in political power, and the growing influence of new social movements. While many Americans embraced the opportunities of this changing landscape, others struggled with the consequences of these transitions, particularly in relation to class, race, and gender dynamics. Jackson's presidency, with its populist appeal and support for the common man, helped usher in a new political and social order, but it also exposed the contradictions and tensions within American society. One of the most important social changes during this time was the rise of the market economy, fueled by innovations such as the cotton gin, steam power, and the expansion of the railroad system. These technological advancements revolutionized agriculture and industry, creating new economic opportunities, but also deepening the divide between the North and South. The growth of cotton production in the South, for example, led to an increasing reliance on slave labor, while the North became more industrialized, with factories and mills providing new jobs for working-class Americans. This shift in economic power had a significant impact on the social structure, as wealth became increasingly concentrated in the hands of industrialists and plantation owners, while the working poor, both in the cities and on the plantations, struggled to make a living. At the same time, the Jacksonian era witnessed a rise in social movements advocating for reform and greater equality. The Second Great Awakening, a religious revival movement, spurred calls for moral and social improvement, including the abolition of slavery, women's rights, and temperance. The abolitionist movement gained momentum, particularly in the North, as activists such as William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass called for the immediate emancipation of slaves and an end to racial injustice. Meanwhile, the women's rights movement began to take shape, with figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organizing the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. These movements challenged traditional notions of power and privilege, advocating for a more inclusive and egalitarian society. However, the benefits of these social transitions were not evenly distributed. While white men, particularly in the West and South, gained greater political power through the expansion of voting rights, other groups remained excluded from full participation in society. Women, African Americans, and Native Americans were largely denied political rights, and the institution of slavery continued to thrive in the South. The struggle for equality and justice for these groups would continue long after Jackson's presidency, with many of the social issues of the Jacksonian era remaining unresolved. The Jacksonian era also saw the growth of a more democratic political culture. Jackson's populist appeal and his efforts to champion the rights of the common man helped foster a more inclusive political system, with the expansion of suffrage and the rise of mass political participation. This period also saw the rise of political parties as an essential component of American politics, with Jackson's Democrats opposing the Whigs, a party formed in opposition to Jackson's policies. The rise of these mass-based parties marked the beginning of a more modern form of American politics, where candidates were increasingly accountable to the people, and their campaigns were driven by public opinion. In conclusion, the Jacksonian era was a time of social and economic upheaval, with the nation undergoing profound changes that reshaped American society. While these transitions offered new opportunities for some, they also deepened existing inequalities and created new divisions within the country. The period's legacy continues to influence American society today, as the issues of race, class, and gender that emerged during this time remain central to the nation's ongoing struggles for equality and justice. Economic shifts and labor movements. The Jacksonian era witnessed profound economic shifts that reshaped the landscape of the United States, particularly in the North and West. The Industrial Revolution was well underway, bringing significant changes to the country's economic structure. New technologies, such as the steam engine, the cotton gin, and improvements in transportation, like railroads and canals, led to rapid industrialization. This transformation created new industries, particularly in manufacturing, and provided new opportunities for economic growth. However, it also introduced new challenges, particularly for the working class, as the rise of factories and urbanization led to the growth of wage labor and the emergence of labor movements. In the North, the expansion of factories and industries, particularly in textiles, iron, and machinery, transformed the economy. The increased use of machines in production meant that labor was increasingly needed to operate and maintain these new systems. As a result, cities grew rapidly, and a new class of factory workers, many of them immigrants from Europe, emerged. These workers were often subjected to long hours, low wages, and unsafe working conditions, leading to widespread discontent. The rise of the factory system also contributed to the growth of a capitalist economy, where the wealth generated by industrial enterprises was often concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy owners, while the workers who powered the machines struggled to make ends meet. The West also experienced significant economic change during this period, driven by the expansion of agriculture. The rise of cotton production, particularly in the South, and the spread of farming to newly acquired lands in the West created a booming agricultural economy. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 revolutionized cotton farming, making it more profitable and leading to an increase in the demand for slave labor. While agriculture thrived in the South and West, the economy in the North shifted toward manufacturing, creating a stark divide between the agrarian South and the industrial North. The growth of industrialization and wage labor prompted the rise of labor movements as workers began to organize in response to their exploitation. These movements aimed to improve working conditions, secure higher wages, and establish better rights for workers. Early labor unions, often limited in scope and influence, began to form in response to the harsh realities of factory life. The most notable early example was the Lowell Mill Girls in Massachusetts, who went on strike in the 1830s to protest their long hours and poor conditions. While labor movements faced significant opposition from factory owners and politicians, they laid the groundwork for the larger labor movements that would emerge in the following decades. Despite the challenges workers faced, these early labor movements marked the beginning of a broader push for workers' rights in the United States. The Jacksonian era, while marked by economic progress and the growth of industry, also highlighted the tensions between capital and labor, between those who benefited from the new economy and those who worked in it. These conflicts set the stage for the social and political struggles that would shape American society in the years to come. Growth of urban centers. The Jacksonian era marked a period of significant urbanization in the United States, as cities began to grow rapidly, driven by industrialization, technological advancements, and the expansion of transportation networks. The rise of factories, the spread of railroads, and the growth of the national economy brought waves of people into urban areas in search of employment and opportunity. This migration from rural areas to cities transformed the social and economic fabric of the nation, giving rise to new urban centers that would continue to expand throughout the 19th century. As industrialization took hold in the North, cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh grew exponentially. Factories, mills, and manufacturing plants began to dot the landscape, attracting workers from rural areas and immigrants from Europe who sought work in the new industries. The invention of steam power and the expansion of the railroad system helped facilitate this movement, making it easier for goods, people, and ideas to flow into and out of cities. The promise of higher wages and better living conditions drew people to urban centers, even though the reality was often far less glamorous. The rapid growth of cities brought significant changes to daily life. Urban centers became hubs of commerce, industry, and culture, but they were also marked by overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Housing in these growing cities was scarce and expensive, leading to the rise of tenements and slums. These cramped, poorly constructed buildings became home to many factory workers and their families, where multiple families often shared small, poorly ventilated apartments. Sanitation was inadequate, and disease spread quickly in these crowded conditions, contributing to high mortality rates among the urban poor. Despite these challenges, urbanization also fostered the growth of a new middle class. The rise of commerce and industry created new opportunities for entrepreneurs, merchants, and professionals, many of whom began to live in more comfortable neighborhoods away from the overcrowded slums. These middle-class families became an integral part of the social structure of cities, fueling the demand for education, services, and cultural amenities. The construction of schools, libraries, theaters, and churches began to shape the social life of urban centers, giving rise to a new public sphere. As cities continued to grow, they also became centers of political activity. The expansion of the electorate and the rise of political parties fueled political engagement among urban residents, who were increasingly involved in local and national elections. The Jacksonian era, with its emphasis on popular democracy and the expansion of suffrage, saw cities become hotbeds of political organizing and activism. Labor movements, social reform efforts, and political campaigns took root in urban centers, setting the stage for future social and political change. In conclusion, the growth of urban centers during the Jacksonian era was a defining feature of American society in the 19th century. It reflected the broader economic and technological changes of the time and had a lasting impact on the structure of American cities. While urbanization brought opportunities for some, it also exposed deep social inequalities, setting the stage for future political and social movements aimed at addressing the challenges of industrialization and urban life. Cultural changes and reform movements. The Jacksonian era was a time of significant cultural change and social reform in the United States. As the country expanded and underwent economic transformation, new ideas about democracy, equality, and morality began to take root. This period saw the rise of various reform movements that aimed to address the challenges of a rapidly changing society, including the push for abolition, women's rights, temperance, and educational reform. These movements were driven by both religious and philosophical ideas, particularly those associated with the Second Great Awakening, a religious revival that emphasized individual empowerment and moral improvement. One of the most important cultural shifts during this time was the rise of the abolitionist movement, which sought to end slavery in the United States. As the country expanded westward, the issue of slavery became increasingly contentious, with abolitionists calling for the immediate emancipation of enslaved people. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman emerged as leaders in the fight against slavery. Their efforts, often through publications, speeches, and direct action, helped to galvanize the movement and raise public awareness of the moral injustices of slavery. While their views were not universally accepted, especially in the South, the abolitionist movement laid the groundwork for the eventual end of slavery and the Civil War. Another significant reform movement during this period was the push for women's rights. The 1830s and 1840s saw the emergence of the first wave of feminism in the United States, as women began to demand greater social, political, and economic equality. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, was a pivotal moment in this movement, where women gathered to discuss their rights and issue a declaration of sentiments calling for equal rights, including the right to vote. While the movement did not achieve all of its goals during the Jacksonian era, it sparked a larger conversation about women's roles in society that would continue for decades. The temperance movement, which aimed to reduce or eliminate the consumption of alcohol, also gained momentum during this period. Advocates for temperance argued that alcohol was the root cause of many social problems, including domestic violence, poverty, and crime. Religious groups and social reformers, particularly in the North, led the charge for temperance, calling for laws to limit alcohol sales and promote moral behavior. The movement was successful in some areas, leading to local bans on alcohol and the eventual rise of the Prohibition movement in the early 20th century. In addition to these movements, there was also a growing emphasis on educational reform. Leaders like Horace Mann pushed for public education to become more widely accessible, particularly for children in rural areas. Mann and others advocated for a standardized, secular education system that would prepare children for the changing economy. This shift in education reflected broader cultural changes as the country became more focused on progress and social improvement. In conclusion, the Jacksonian era was marked by a surge in cultural and social reform movements that sought to address the injustices and inequalities of American society. While not all of these movements were successful in their immediate goals, they set the stage for broader changes that would shape the nation's future, particularly in the areas of civil rights, women's rights, and social welfare. The cultural changes of the Jacksonian era were essential in defining the moral and political landscape of the 19th century United States. You have been listening to The Age of Jackson, The Rise of Democracy in America, written by Harry Montgomery, narrated by Cedar Reyes.